Alright, it's time to assemble the rods and pistons together. I wanted to go over a couple of steps that I use to make sure that I assemble everything correctly and in the right direction. So I've got my pistons and rods laid out here. I've already assembled one side of the engine, and I'll talk about the orientation that I like to put things in, so I'm not putting things together wrong, because you can do this wrong. Everything has to be together a certain way whenever you're doing this kind of stuff. So what I like to do is, so these pistons are oriented so that the front of the engine is facing that way. So I have, in the firing order for the engine, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So when you look at these pistons, they have a dot on them. That dot faces the front of the engine. So I make sure that I orient the pistons so they're facing towards the front of the engine up there. And if you look on the piston, it says R right there next to all that writing. That means that this piston goes on the right side of the engine, and that's facing from the back to the front, the right side of the engine. So the reason for that is so that your valve reliefs line up. So whenever you're putting the rods onto the pistons, remember we talked about the chamfer on the rod, and how there's a flat side and a chamfered side, and the chamfered side has to face the crankshaft and the flat side faces the other rod, because between the two sides of the engine, two rods are going to share the same journal on the crankshaft. So I know that the right bank of the engine, all the pistons and rods on the right bank of the engine share or use the front side of each journal on the crankshaft, and the left side uses the rear part of the journal on the crankshaft for each prospective rod journal. So I know that with the piston oriented towards the front of the engine, I know that all of the right bank, 1, 2, 3, and 4, the rod is going to have to face the front of the engine, so that it's that chamfered side of the rod right there is facing the crankshaft. So that's how you go about assembling those. It's pretty straightforward, putting the wrist pin through the piston and through the rod. I can show you real quick how it's done. It's not hard. You have the wrist pin, you have the piston, wrist pin goes through the piston, push it through the piston, push the wrist pin through the piston, and then the rod goes like so, and the wrist pin goes through. So once that's together, there's a couple of different kind of locks that are used to hold the wrist pin. I'll put this wrist pin in the piston so you can get a visual on it. So there's several different, there's two that I know of. There's a thing called a spiro lock, which is like a wound up coil that goes inside of here and fills the groove. As you can see, there's a groove right there. That's where the spiro lock, or the other lock, which I'll show you here in a second, lock in on each side of the piston, and it holds the wrist pin in the piston. So what I have are these little C-clip deals. You can see them through the bag right there. And all this C-clip does, and I'll show you a piston that's already assembled, is as it pushes down and goes into that groove, and that's what holds the wrist pin in the piston. So it's pretty simple, straightforward. It's not hard. You just want to make sure that you're assembling everything correctly. Everything's oriented correctly, and everything is put together so that it's going to be facing the right direction. It's a very crucial step, because if you put this together wrong, you could have an issue. You could have a failure, a bearing failure, or something. You know, it's just good to make sure that everything's put together right. Yeah, that's all I got, and I'll talk about putting the rings on the pistons after I get these assembled. Okay, here we go. So all the pistons and rods are put together and ready to install the piston rings on the pistons. So starting off, you want to clean your rings. Same as before with how I clean the rod bearings and all the other surfaces. Put some brake cleaner on cloth and wipe them down. I've already wiped these down. So here's the oil control rings here. It's a set of 3. There's the top ring and the second ring. So another thing that I've went through and done already is I took a small piece of sandpaper, and I did it whenever I was filing the rings. I took the edges off here, off the edges of the ends of the ring. I took the edges down, but I took them down, just made sure that there was no edges on them with this little piece of sandpaper, so I don't the piston rings don't scar the cylinder walls when I put them in. So according to Total Seal's instructions, which I have here, the top ring or the top or second ring you install with the there's either a dot or a laser engraving on the ring, and you install that facing up. And then I'll show you guys how to install the oil control rings. So starting out with the oil control rings, I believe this is called the oil rail. So you want to install this first, and it goes down here on the bottom groove of the piston. So install that. One thing you want to be as careful as possible when you're putting these rings on, because they have tension built into them, and if you stretch them out too far, you can take the tension out of the ring, and then you're going to have issues. So the oil rail is on, and then the other 2 go on. So one ring goes under the oil rail, and one ring goes on top of the oil rail. So go ahead and do that. What I like to do is take the first part of the ring and go ahead and put it wherever it's going to go. So this first one's going to go under. So I'll put it under the oil rail like so, and then work my way around. Take your time. Try not to deform the ring. Trying to only deform the ring as little as possible to get it on over the piston. And then when you get around to this edge over here, you want to guide that edge down so it doesn't scratch the piston. Work my way around. Let's see, the ring's caught up right here. And you're gonna fight these old rings a little bit. It's just the nature of them. The bottom one's on. Same for the other ring here, it goes on top of the oil rail. All right, so those are on. Make sure it's not binding up, make sure everything is right. So the next ring that goes on would be the second ring. So as you can see, there is the laser engraving on the ring. So that means that that side faces up. Means it will face towards the top of the piston. And another way that I can check this is the instructions also say that on the second ring, if there isn't any engraving on it, unmarked rings with an inner bevel, installed bevel side down. So I look at this laser engraving and I hold it up, and then I can look, and it's hard to tell on camera, but there's a bevel on the back side of the face right here, and that is facing down, so I know this ring is oriented correctly. So this is where a set of ring pliers is important. These rings have a lot of tension. The oil rings don't have as much tension as the second and top ring do. So if you try to put one of these on the piston, you can scratch the piston, or you could mess this ring up and take the tension out of it. And that's actually something that comes with these rings. It tells you to install them with ring pliers. So these things are pretty cheap. I want to say they're like $8 off of Amazon. So a good investment. And they make life pretty easy. You just put the ring in the pliers like that, squeeze the pliers, take your piston, and install this second ring in the second groove of the piston. It's not perfect, but I can work it in. All right, so the second ring is in with the laser engraving facing up. And do the same thing for the top ring. And also with this top ring, it says that on top rings that don't have a laser engraving on them, the bevel side should face up. So I look at my laser engraving here. You can see it right there. And I hold it up, and I look here on the face of the ring. And it's hard to tell, but there is a bevel there, and it's facing up. So that is the correct orientation for this top ring. Same thing, put the pliers on, open the ring up, install it in the top groove of the piston. Fight it a little bit. It kind of deforms whenever you open it up, so you have to mess with it a little bit to get it to go on correctly. There you have it. The top ring, laser engraving is facing up. So you have your oil rail, second ring, top ring, and that's all there is to it.